Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Karako. I'm a senior fellow in the International Security Program here at CSIS. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today as we, among other things, mark the first anniversary, or at least pretty close to it, of the Aegis Ashore site in Deveselu, Romania, which was operationally certified on May 12, 2016. This was a proud moment for missile defense in Europe and for the NATO alliance, which had declared missile defense a core alliance mission at Lisbon in 2010. And both the operational certification and the later declaration of initial operating capability for Deveselu is but the latest example of how missile defense represents an established component of not merely American security architecture, but also that of numerous allies and partners. And in Europe, of course, this includes many countries. The NATO alliance also, for instance, home ports for Aegis BMD destroyers in Rota, Spain, as of September 2015. And a second Aegis Ashore site is already under construction at Rzykowa, Poland, for which a lot of work has already been done. Indeed, it's been 1 year as well since the groundbreaking for Rzykowa on May 13 of last year. And these Aegis Ashore sites represent an important benchmark in European missile defense and what can be done when allies come together in the face of new and emerging threats. And besides Romania's leadership within NATO on defense broadly, it's also worth noting that Romania is recently considering some additional air defenses, Patriot in particular. And just today, we heard that additional deployments might be under consideration by the United States and other parts of northeastern parts of NATO. All of which I think makes today's event very timely. And so we'd like to welcome and thank Ambassador George Cristian Maior from Romania, who has a distinguished career in diplomacy, defense, and intelligence, as well as a legislator. He served as ambassador to the U.S. since 2015, and previously worked in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and served as the chargé in Ireland. In 2006, he was appointed the 4th Director of Romanian Intelligence and served in that position for 8 years. In 2004, Mr. Maior was elected senator in the Romanian Parliament, where he held several leadership positions for defense and intelligence and human rights. And between 2000 and 2004, he held the position of State Secretary and head of the Department for Euro-Atlantic Integration and Defense Policy within the Ministry of National Defense, where, among other things, importantly, he was responsible for coordinating strategic and military dimensions of Romania's accession to NATO. So this is an important time for NATO, of course, and Ambassador Maior, we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, of course, I'm very honored to address this distinguished audience of the Center for Strategic and International Studies on Romania's, as you mentioned, contribution to European missile defense. First of all, let me express my gratitude to the CSIS leadership, to Dr. Hamre. He's not here, but his involvement in this project is very much appreciated. And of course, his first ranked team for pursuing with highest dedication and expertise matters that are of utmost importance for international security. I think for the United States, of course, for Europe as well as for our transatlantic alliance. Through leadership, creative thinking, and engagement. Our subject today, already mentioned here, missile defense, is just one of these matters, and I'm glad that the CSIS Missile Defense Project, led by Tom Karako, brings a highly relevant contribution to this area across the many facets of this very complex subject indeed. You mentioned, Tom, this week marks the anniversary of 1 year since, or almost 1 year since the United States Aegis Ashore missile defense system in Deveselu, a very small village in Romania, became operational. With its transfer to the NATO ballistic missile defense capability last year in July at the Warsaw Summit, It brought a significant increase in capability to defend all allies against ballistic missile threats from outside the Euro-Atlantic area. As we celebrate indeed this important achievement, I would like to thank all those that have worked hard with devotion to make this endeavor possible, to keep our countries and the NATO alliance safe and secure. I am glad, in fact, to see many of those who contributed join us today. Mr. Frank Rose, thank you for coming, and thank you for your contribution, indeed. Today's event provides us with a timely opportunity, I believe, to discuss missile defense as proliferation of the threat of ballistic missile is increasing. Furthermore, last Friday, the US Department of Defense announced its commencement of the Ballistic Missile Defense Review. Within this context, allow me to point out to the value of the Aegis Ashore missile defense facility hosted by Romania for the development of the NATO ballistic missile defense capability. And perhaps this will add to the ongoing discussions about the value of missile defenses today in this very complicated and complex security environment. So first, over the past years, we have witnessed overall negative developments, in my opinion, in international security and stability. The 2014 annexation of Crimea fits in a pattern of breaches of international law and commitments. Further back in time, 2008, invasion of Georgia, aggression then in eastern Ukraine, the use of hybrid warfare tactics, the military build-up in the Black Sea and across the whole NATO eastern flank, up to the Baltic Sea, reflect an approach based on the use of force, aggressive policies, and of course geopolitical competition, and unfortunately the rejection of cooperation and engagement. Developments in the east of NATO confirm the strategic importance of the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea regions for the whole Euro-Atlantic area. Of course, we have also witnessed the extraordinary impact of terrorism, including, of course, from non-state actors like Daesh, which have capabilities that hold the whole Middle East at risk, with a further impact on Europe and beyond. Therefore, we live in an increasingly unpredictable, and I will say uncertain world, where our security and defense cannot be taken for granted. That is why we believe that deterrence and dialogue have a very significant role in the current context. Consolidation of NATO, including through burden sharing, remains, of course, essential. As far as Romania is concerned, we take this commitment very seriously. As of February this year, Romania is appropriating a yearly 2% of the GDP for defense spending, and more importantly, in my opinion, as a former defense official also, a significant share of this budget, I will say around 40%, is or will be directed towards military procurement, capabilities, and readiness over the next years. Romania has recently completed the acquisition of 12 US F-16 fighter jets. Efforts are underway for a major modernization and procurement process, including investments that you mentioned in air defense systems. But that's just one example. There are many other aspects related to the planning of defense for Romania for the medium and the long term. Ladies and gentlemen, to my second point, in this context and aside from the security challenges reflected above, we continue to be faced with a continuous ballistic missile threat, widely acknowledged with a growing interest from state and non-state stakeholders to acquire advanced missile technology, which poses immediate risks to our populations, forces, and territories, sometimes even greater than conventional threats. Once unpredictable actors, of course, acquire, possess, and further develop this technology, it is easier to attempt to project force, to threaten and to look for political advantages using this capability. Only this year, we have witnessed many instances when the world has seen blunt threats from regional actors based on their possession of ballistic missiles, and this has taken many forms, you all know. Aggressive rhetorics, provocative missile testing, parade of ballistic missiles, and so on. We need not look further back than just a few weeks ago to the latest episode, of course, of North Korean adventure to understand this sober reality. Closer to NATO's neighborhood, proliferation of ballistic missiles of increasing range and sophistication has continued. The Iranian nuclear agreement, of course, of 2015 is an important achievement in terms of security and stability, but does not address the ballistic missile program, as we all know. This demonstrates unequivocally that the threat posed by the proliferation of ballistic missiles is real. Within NATO, this threat has been acknowledged through the declarations and decisions of NATO Bucharest and Strasbourg Kiel summits, leading to the Lisbon summit of 2010 decision to develop an ally missile defense capability to pursue the core task of collective defense. The aim of this capability is to provide full coverage and protection for all NATO European populations, territory, and forces against the increasing threats posed by the proliferation of ballistic missiles from outside the Euro-Atlantic area, a significant political decision reaffirmed by all summit declarations since then. Within this context, as a member of NATO and sharing an excellent bilateral relationship with the United States, reflected in our 20 years of strategic partnership. In fact, this year we'll have this important celebration also, since the inauguration of the strategic partnership between Romania and US in the context of the visit of President Clinton to Romania. Romania's decision to host elements of the US-European phased adaptive approach came as a natural contribution, in our opinion, to the development of the NATO PMD capability. Romania's participation in the missile defense has enjoyed strong political and public support. The Ballistic Missile Defense Agreement between the United States and Romania, negotiated, Mr. Rose knows well, between 2010 and 2011, was signed and ratified almost unanimously by the Romanian Parliament in 2011. This was followed, of course, by intensive cooperation on secondary protocols covering a range of aspects, many technical aspects, while construction works of the Aegis Ashore broke ground in October 2013 and was, of course, completed in 2016. This exceptional cooperation with the United States remains a confirmation of the US commitment to European security and a guarantee of our transatlantic bond. Thus, the first Aegis Ashore has strategic values on all accounts. Teamwork has also been the key word in the development of the NATO ballistic missile defense capability. Last year, as mentioned here, Aegis Ashore was made operational and transferred to NATO. The alliance declared the NATO BMD initial operational capability at the Warsaw Summit. This has been made possible by the contribution of many allies besides the US, contributions through the US EPAA. Germany hosts the Ally Command Center, Turkey hosts an early warning radar. Spain hosts 4 US Aegis ships in Rota. Denmark and the Netherlands upgrade ships with radar capabilities. UK contributes with ground-based radars. Furthermore, a second Aegis Ashore that Poland hosts at Regiko base is planned to become operational next year as well. Other allies such as France or Italy provide air and missile defense systems or ships as force protection of BMD assets. As allies, we attach great importance to the development of the NATO BMD capability towards achieving full operational capability. This responds to the serious ballistic missile threats posed by the ballistic missile proliferations, as mentioned here, such as the program developed by Iran, and is consistent with policy decisions taken over the past decade. Furthermore, a credible defense and deterrence to prevent conflict is based on an appropriate mix of nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities, all part of NATO overall strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say a few words, of course, on this sensitive issue, the defensive character of the NATO BMD and Aegis Ashore, and certain claims that it's against Russia. Well, I'll say from the very beginning, I've reiterated this, many have done this, it is not. The NATO missile defense capability, as well as the Aegis Ashore missile defense facility, has been from the very beginning, as conceptually and then practically, an entirely defensive endeavor, developed in the spirit of cooperation and transparency. They do not aim to undermine or weaken Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent. The small numbers of interceptors, the location of the sites in Romania as well as in Poland, makes it technically impossible to intercept Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles. The ballistic missile defense agreement, furthermore, between United States and Romania explicitly mentions that the system shall be used in full compliance with the UN Charter for legitimate self-defense and shall not possess offensive capabilities. The agreement also provides that the interceptors deployed in Romania are non-nuclear. They destroy a ballistic missile through the kinetic force of their impact and carry no explosive charge. These aspects have been made clear to Russia many times. And Russia was invited to cooperate on missile defense in the past. Let us remember that Russia unilaterally terminated cooperation with NATO on missile defense in October 2013. More recently, Russia claimed that the NATO missile defense and the Aegis Ashore violate the INF Treaty. This claim was repeated also 10 days ago, I believe, despite well-known facts mentioned already here, that the Aegis Ashore system cannot be used to launch missiles covered by the INF Treaty. We strongly believe that the adherence to the INF Treaty should continue, as it is important for preserving, of course, European security. Now let me conclude, and I'll be happy to try to answer your questions or to listen to your commentaries. Let me conclude by saying that NATO missile defense is about our joint allied contribution to a capability that embodies the key principles of allied solidarity and indivisibility of security. The NATO BMD capability contributes to the overall collective defense of the alliance, to effective and credible deterrence, as well as to strengthening the transatlantic link. I firmly believe it is an opportunity to reinforce a consistent, cost-effective policy for more engagement among allies, for more stability and security in our area. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Once again, thank you for hosting this event, and of course, we're ready to try to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Maior. This was a great overview, and I wondered if we might sort of start off by focusing on one of the things you mentioned along the way, and that was really the kind of the broad-based support and political consensus in Romania for supporting the missile defense mission. I wonder if you could elaborate on that. How would you describe that?
Yes, it's full support coming across various political parties. First of all, the Parliament voted almost unanimously for this agreement, irrespective of the color of the government, the political color of the. That's very important. But I think more important the fact that the population overall supports NATO is a security guarantee. Polls constantly indicate 80% support for NATO, which is, I think, a very significant figure. Support for the partnership with US constantly at 80%, and of course, including the deployment of the missile defense in this overall strategic context. So I think legitimacy in terms of population perceptions of threats, but also of opportunities in terms of cooperation for security and stability is very important nowadays when we live in such a complicated security environment.
Well, I think it's especially remarkable to hear just of that political consensus and that popular consensus as well, especially in the face of a lot of pressure. And it seems like no member of NATO can contribute a circuit board to the larger missile defense mission without getting a threat of some kind from Russia. What's your take on that? Romania has had its share for hosting the Aegis Ashore site. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, the overall perception on threats should not be linked necessarily to Russia. Of course, there have been events that really generated concerns all over the region. Poland is represented here, Bulgaria, other allies from Central and Eastern Europe, because of the aspects mentioned that happened in the region in the last decade, let's say, war in Georgia, annexation of Crimea, instability in Ukraine, other more subtle aspects related to some aggressive policies in the region coming from the eastern frontier, without naming necessarily states, but take the risk of proliferation. It's related also to non-state actors, to this idea which is very cynical and could have a dramatic impact on security. A non-state actor acquiring such capabilities will really make terrorism, as ugly as it is today, even more dramatic in its impact. So I think all those events corroborated, generated a certain threat perception, which is intense among NATO allies in the region, I think among NATO allies in general, and because of that, those discussions in NATO, how to adapt to those challenges.
And you mentioned along the way that the Iranian deal did not address the missile question, of course. Let me go after that. You also mentioned along the way that as the United States has so frequently reminded Russia and has stated publicly that these capabilities are incapable of chasing Russian ICBMs, it's just not possible. But let me shift, therefore, to the lower tier stuff. You mentioned Romania's interest in potentially pursuing a Patriot or some other air defense type things. I'm struck by the fact that Russia has a lot of S-300, S-400 defenses of its own on the northeast and the southeast parts of NATO. Why doesn't it seem odd that it's okay for Russia to have all those things, but every time a NATO member pursues some Patriots or something, it's called destabilizing and provocative? Is that?
Well, it's a very good question and interesting one. Of course, let's get back to this narrative that missile defense violates the INF Treaty and has offensive capabilities. Technically, it doesn't, and we've explained that, and Mr. Rose, I think, is here many times, has given interviews, statements, the State Department, others, us, that it's a defensive element. It's not possessing offensive capabilities, and technically this is proven. But apart from this, of course, with all those developments in security in the region, either classical threats, you mentioned militarization of certain areas, perhaps also Crimea, development in capabilities, modernization of militaries on the eastern frontier of NATO. I think a posture of intelligent deterrence is needed for the alliance, for the reassurances of our basic concept, which is collective security. And countries that are trying to modernize their military, to allocate, as I mentioned, we allocate 2% this year, and from this year, the next 10 years will be this allocation of 2% of the GDP to defense in order to modernize the military is a reflection of the need to have a credible and intelligent deterrence in line with other developments, military developments at our frontiers. And I think this is justified. We are not the only ones embarking on such a defense strategy. Other countries from the region do that. NATO as a collective organization does that, and I think this is a response to a security environment which is in a very, unfortunately, negative dynamic right now. Let's hope for the best, and then discussions for more rational discussions for cooperation in terms of security and stability. But now it's not a situation that will make us refrain from trying to modernize our military to respond to those threats in terms of deterrence and legitimate self-defense, ultimately.
Well, you mentioned a couple areas. You mentioned the Black Sea, Crimea, and given
the Baltic Sea,
the Baltics as well. But given, frankly, the introduction of various A2AD capabilities there, just say the Black Sea, for instance, or that general region, is there something that the United States, that Romania, that NATO broadly, or other partners and allies could or should be doing to address what's going on there?
Yes, that they're doing. For example, we are doing together the Warsaw Summit. Decisions were taken in terms of enhanced forward presence on territory of certain allies in Central and Eastern Europe, on the eastern flank, developments in Poland, developments in Romania with a multinational brigade that is being now under construction, let's say, with the contribution of some allies, including Poland. We are sending also to Poland a contribution we already did, in fact, to the multinational brigade on their territory. Also in the Black Sea, framework of more enhanced cooperation among NATO allies, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey. Discussions are ongoing based on decisions taken in the Warsaw Summit. Of course, there are many aspects to discuss, many nuances. The Black Sea is complicated in its history, but it deserves clearly attention from a strategic point of view, since all those events that I've mentioned, reiterate again, war in Georgia, Crimea, Ukraine as a riparian country, are taking place in this region, unfortunately. Not to speak about frozen conflicts among the shores of this sea, or the extended region, Transnistria, Abkhazia, Georgia. Things worrying from a security point of view.
And there's been a lot of attention, obviously, especially in the Northeast. But speaking broadly, are there some things that could be done to make kind of the regional cooperation within NATO more meaningful on NATO's eastern flank, including in the southeast?
I think all the decisions, the political decisions are clear about this. It depends now on the allies to accelerate aspects related to schemes of cooperation that I think are needed for the alliance as such in its integrality. Mentioned this framework for maritime cooperation among the three allies in the Black Sea, Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria as an example. Other common exercises among the NATO allies in the Black Sea. So the Black Sea, unfortunately, is becoming more and more maritime border with a very uncertain area in the eastern part of that border. And it's our ambition to see the Black Sea as an area of cooperation and stability. It's our aim to achieve that. But clearly those developments require more concentration of the alliance on the Black Sea.
Good. Well, why don't we open it up actually to questions from the floor? We've got some microphones to go around. If folks want to just raise their hands and introduce yourself briefly and keep your comments in the interrogative tense. Right here.
Thank you. I am Tytti Erästö from the Plowshare. Regarding the Russian concerns about the launch pads in the Aegis Ashore site, would you be open to have inspections at the site to address the Russian concerns, to make sure that they are not used for offensive purposes?
Well, it was, for example, open to the press at its inauguration. Everybody had access over there, speaking in general about an issue of full transparency. I think it was also covered by the aerial inspections that are taking place under the relevant agreements. So this is an aspect that can be further discussed. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, Russia's reluctance since 2013 to discuss this aspect, not necessarily this, but missile defense in general, is right now clear and impediment to this.
Transparency on both sides, I think, would be good. Who else?
My name is Glenn Howard, President of Jamestown Foundation. My question is that today General Mattis has been in the Baltic visiting Lithuania, and we have seen in the Baltic states, United States, working with Canadians, Estonians, or the Canadians and the Germans and the UK, are developing an enhanced forward presence in the Baltic. When you look at the Romania and the Black Sea region, you don't see an enhanced forward presence of any kind really in the Black Sea region. And could you just talk about why is there such a disparity in the way that NATO looks at the Baltic, but at the Black Sea, as you mentioned, you've got the Crimean annexation, you've got the Georgian War of 2008. It would seem the Black Sea should be a higher priority for American and NATO policymakers.
Well, I won't say that the word disparity really defines, because there are nuances, of course, in approaches, and the Baltics have their concern in terms of security due to other factors, geographical factors, population factors, and we really share their concerns in terms of apprehensions related to security in that region. It's called enhanced forward presence, I think, in terms of the approach to the Baltics, in terms of the approach to the Black Sea, which is the southern part of the eastern flank. Let's say it's called tailored presence. So it's a technical nuance or a difference in semantics or language to define the approach of NATO. But I think NATO has responded to our analysis and others' analysis, other allies' analysis with respect to the Black Sea region. And this is confirmed, I think, by the language. If you read the language in the declaration of the Warsaw Summit, highlighting the importance of the Black Sea, the strategic importance, and the decisions taken in terms of this forward tailored presence, the creation of a multinational brigade in Romania in cooperation with other allies from the region, which is a NATO asset, this framework for cooperation in the Black Sea among three allies, not to speak about the US, let's say, involvement, which is strong in terms of recognizing the importance of the regions through the ERI program, which is going on very well. We had just last month common exercises at the Black Sea among our troops, including your Abrams tanks, the deployment of a battalion together with the Romanian military over there. Common exercises. We'll have the biggest exercise in the region, Sabre Guardian, if I'm correct, in terms of the denomination, very soon together. So I will say that it's more and more recognizable as a very important strategic aspect in terms of security. The Black Sea, and it's not necessarily a disparity or a discrepancy among approaches with the Baltics. It's just focusing on specific aspects related to this particular region by comparison with the Baltic characteristics in terms of security.
It might be something that the American public might need to pay more attention to in relative terms as well. Who else?
Yeah, the public, yeah.
Right,
really,
right.
Yeah.
It's certainly being thought about.
Yeah.
Well, actually, let me follow up with another quick question there. You know, it was, what, 2006 was the cyber attack on Estonia. The Lisbon summit identified not only missile defense, but also cyber as obviously another core mission for NATO. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that and what you're thinking about for various cyber threats.
Yeah, it's clearly one new aspect, but not new anymore, not even here, in terms of potential usage of cyber as an offensive political weapon. Cyber was acknowledged as an aspect that should be taken into consideration as a risk to our security at various NATO summits, including, I think, the Bucharest summit was first to mention cyber security as an important element in our collective defense. Since then, the creation of various cyber defense elements in NATO. We have a Assistant Secretary General for emerging threats, including cyber in NATO. Of course, the creation of the cyber center in the Baltic region. I think it will become more and more relevant in terms of our collective and national securities for various reasons. We can have an entire seminar dedicated to this and even more because of the evolution of technology, because of the way certain states pursue cyber as an element of projecting power. It's very versatile, very complicated to counteract. Countries like Romania are developing cybersecurity systems to respond defensively to those type of threats, which I think will increase in relevance in the future, in my opinion.
And one other aspect that you mentioned along the way was just sort of the cooperation between Romania and Poland, as well as others in a special way. I know you mentioned sort of the broader, but of course Romania and Poland are both hosting Aegis Ashore sites. I wonder if there's something you might elaborate about that relationship, and as well as kind of the interconnectivity between this effort.
I think it's a strong partnership, one of the most profound and efficient in NATO and in this part of the eastern flank of NATO. Ultimately, we are the largest states in this area, with ramifications to both geographical directions of the eastern flank, the northern part and the southern part. We have a good military and intelligence cooperation among our countries. We have similar evaluations of the security environment. I think consultations among us are important for, first of all, for security and stability in the region, for bringing to the attention of allies developments in terms of security in the region. And if we can expand this a bit, also Turkey is part of a regular forum of consultation with Romania and Poland, an interesting triangle in terms of communication, in terms of security and stability. Of course, very good relations with other allies in the region, Bulgaria or others. But it's a relevant partnership for us.
Great. Who else? Back in the back, and then we'll come up here.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Kate Lavender. I'm a reporter and Europe analyst with the Cyber Brief. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. Going back to cyber, so NATO has the 2% defense spending goal, and in addition to that, the 20% of defense spending to be spent on equipment goal. With NATO increasing capabilities in cyber, and with countries recognizing that this is becoming the new battlefield, the new battlefront, do you think that NATO is going to create any kind of cyber benchmark for countries? And is Romania prepared to meet that if it does? Thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned, very good question. I think it's becoming a very significant element in NATO's overall strategy and inside the cooperation. I think when we speak about increase in terms of defense spending, modernization of the military, we should also take into consideration this element, the cyber defense. But cybersecurity is even larger as a concept, and I think here perhaps a discussions about benchmarks in terms of what we should do more to protect our infrastructure, or national infrastructure, from cyber attacks, from cyber espionage, and for cyber operations designed to create instability and diversion in terms of internal politics in certain countries. Here it's a very sensitive and complicated discussion. It's, however, starting. I think, again, this will be a threat that will stay with us forever because of technology and because of its pervasive nature in its usage. And we should reflect more on how to counteract this aspect, how to even create a legal international regime in terms of cyber. Those discussions are very incipient, however, and very complicated.
Well, actually, let me follow that up with you served for several years as the head of the Romanian intelligence service.
Difficult position.
Let me ask you a question. do you think that some of your NATO colleagues are as attentive to kind of the need for counterintelligence to counter not merely the cyber means of shaping events, but others as well? I mean, that's the sort of thing that it's non-kinetic. It's not even, doesn't even have to be cyber, but it's the counter. Your take on that?
I understand the question. Well, it's always sensitive to discuss those issues, but in terms of counterintelligence, we all thought and dreamt that after 1989 this issue will slow in terms of its effectiveness for countries, let's say, use of such methods in their policy. It didn't, unfortunately. On the contrary, it became more sophisticated with the evolution of technology. And I think NATO as a collective organization should try to further develop in quality its intelligence capability, which is not an easy task. It's doing a lot, but it's not easy at all. Nations are always more sensitive when coming to cooperation in terms of sharing their secrets. That's a fact, but progress has been made because of the common need to protect ourselves from such methods, which are non-conventional and unfortunately so efficient sometimes in terms of their relevance to what damage they can do.
Okay. Right up here. Right to your right.
Pierce Gordon, retired arms control official in the State Department, the Arms Control Agency, way back. Mr. Ambassador, you spoke about your anxiety about the proliferation of missile threats, I assume from outside the Euro-Atlantic region. Do you see that primarily in terms of a vertical proliferation from Iran, or are there other locations, other states where you see a threat emerging from ballistic missiles or other types of missiles?
Well, thank you. Well, that's just an example. I don't want to further develop on what I said, but you know well that the Iranian deal doesn't approach the ballistic missile program with respect to Iran. But when we think about proliferation, I think we should think about this threat as a long-term threat, which can have unpredictable evolution with non-state actors. And this is, we know this, so determined to acquire such technologies. And this aspects, I think, relates to a long-term problem and challenge that we'll have to face in respect to this unpredictable security environment. When imagine a non-state actor acquiring such technology and using it in terrorist activities, which will be the nightmare for our national security. And this I have also in mind when I speak about counter-proliferation as a threat that is so relevant today, not only from states, but also from non-state actors thinking in the long term. But now, of course, you mentioned Iran, North Korea is on always the agenda today. Big issues.
Good. We probably have time for two more. Who wants to weigh in? Well, I'll follow up on that question. I think in a way you mentioned different kinds of missiles, and I wanted to draw attention to the Russian cruise missiles that the State Department since 2014 has been pointing out as violating the INF Treaty. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that and whether you think that's getting enough attention.
Well, it should get attention and should be part of the dialogue that should take place with Russia. If we speak about, of course, dialogue, which is needed. We need it also. as a country in terms of a rational approach to diplomacy and stability in the region, but we need it on a serious equal footing in terms of seriously pointing out to what we have in common as challenges. We mentioned terrorism, of course, Syria, those things that where we can cooperate, but also issues that are divergent in our understanding of the security environment, including what you mentioned right now.
Good. Well, Ambassador Maior, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This was, I think, a great exchange. Appreciate your time. What we're going to do is we're going to take a quick coffee break, and we'll come back for a panel, which will include Frank Rose, Punch Moulton, Maciej Kowalsi, and myself, and we'll kind of continue the conversation. So, but thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Break, and we're going to start our panel in a moment, but first, let me do a few introductions. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm a senior fellow and deputy director of the Europe program here at CSIS. And I'll run down the line in order in which people will speak. Frank Rose, who I'm sure many of you know, was most recently Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance. He has a long career before that as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, as well as a senior official at the Pentagon and on the Hill. So his experience spans many, many years and all parts of our national security bureaucracy. Next to him, we have retired Major General Punch Moulton, who was the Director of Operations at the U.S. European Command as his last assignment and the one perhaps most relevant to today's discussion, but also a long career in the Air Force going back decades, including service at NORAD, and in the Asia Pacific. He's now the Senior Director for Cyber Strategies, Innovation, and Consulting at Stellar Solutions. And in the middle, we have Maciej Kowalsi, who is a researcher at the Kazimierz Pulaski Foundation in Poland. And to my left, Tom Karako, whom you've already met and is the director of our missile defense project here, missile defense program here at CSIS. And with that, I would like to ask Frank Rose to take the podium, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how we got to where we are, where things stand, and how things look for the future. So Frank, please take it away.
Great. Well, Jeff, thanks very much for the kind introduction. And let me thank CSIS and the Missile Defense Project for hosting today's event. I'm very much delighted to be on the stage with the panelists and to be with the ambassador, who I've worked with for quite some time. As many of you know, I work closely with our Romanian allies as the lead U.S. negotiator for missile defense basing agreement with Romania from 2010 to 2011. To quote former U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, I was indeed present at the creation. And having worked with our Romanian colleagues, I will tell you the United States has no better friend than Romania. They are a leader in NATO, and they are a true global partner for the United States on security issues around the world, including their long-standing service in Afghanistan. In my remarks today, I'd like to focus on three areas. First, I want to provide you a little of the history of how we got to where we are with the Aegis Ashore site in Romania. Secondly, I'll say a few words about the continuing importance of the site in Romania and the second site that we are building in Poland. Third, I'll address my absolutely favorite subject, missile defense in Russia. Let's start with a few words about the history of the deployments. In September 2009, former President Obama announced the European Phased Adaptive Approach, or EPAA, which called for the deployment of Aegis Ashore sites in Europe to address the threat from Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program. The EPAA was intended to be the U.S. contribution to a larger NATO missile defense system, which the alliance established at the Lisbon Summit in 2010. The first Aegis Ashore site was to be deployed in southern Europe to address the short and medium-range threat from the Middle East. Romania was chosen as the location for the site for a variety of reasons, including its geography, its long-standing relationship with the United States, and the fact that we had an existing defense cooperation agreement and a status of forces agreement. The official offer was made to Romania in February 2010 during a visit by then Undersecretary of State Ellen Tauscher. I'll always remember being in the room with Undersecretary Tauscher when she made the official request to President Deveselu. Immediately after the meeting with the President, he convened a meeting of the Romanian National Security Council to seek their agreement to the request. And by the end of the day, he announced the Romanian decision on Romanian national television. Now, that's what I call a well-run interagency process. If only the U.S. interagency could be so efficient. After the political decision was made, the real work then began. To accomplish this, we established two working groups. One focused on negotiating the legal agreement to allow for the site, and the second focused on identifying the actual site. The agreements working group was led by myself and Bogdan Orescu, the State Secretary for Strategic Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Bogdan later served as Romanian Foreign Minister and is currently the Foreign Policy Advisor to President Iohannis. The siting group was led by Rear Admiral Randy Hendrickson, the former Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Agency, and General Necuț from the Romanian Ministry of Defense. The cooperation we received from our Romanian colleagues was excellent. As a result of this cooperation, we were able to complete work on the basing agreement and choose the site by summer 2011. The final agreement was signed by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and her Romanian counterpart in September 2011 and ratified by the Romanian Parliament at the end of the year. With the completion of these agreements, the job was turned over to Admiral Searing and his team at the Missile Defense Agency, working in close collaboration with U.S. European Command to begin construction of the site, which was completed in late 2015. And as you know, the official ribbon cutting ceremony took place on May 10th of 2016. Now, there are some who argue that with the successful conclusion of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, with Iran, there is no need to move forward with the missile defense sites in Europe. As I noted earlier, when President Obama announced the European Phased Adaptive Approach to European missile defense in September 2009, he made clear that the deployment was being made to address both the Iranian nuclear program and their ballistic missile program. While the JCPOA, which I strongly support for the record, addresses the nuclear threat from Iran, it does not address Iran's continued deployment of ballistic missiles. Indeed, since the JCPOA came into force last year, Iran has continued to develop and test its ballistic missile capabilities. Furthermore, some also argue that you don't need to worry about conventionally armed ballistic missiles. And my response to that is even conventionally armed ballistic missiles can have strategic consequences. Look at 1991. In 1991, Saddam Hussein launched conventional missiles at Israel with the strategic objective of bringing Israel into the war and breaking up the coalition. I would argue it was deployment of US, Dutch, and German patriots to Israel, even though not 100% effective, played a key role in managing the crisis and keeping Israel out of the war. Furthermore, Iran continues to improve the accuracy of their systems. The trend is absolutely clear. Iran remains committed to its ballistic missile program and shows absolutely no signs whatsoever to scaling back that program. Therefore, the Aegis Ashore sites have an important role to play in countering this threat. Let me now briefly say a few words about the Aegis Ashore sites in Russia. The Russians basically have two concerns about the Aegis Ashore sites, both which I believe are false. First, they argue that the sites represent a threat to Russia's strategic deterrent. Given geography, numbers of interceptors deployed, and Russia's deployment of advanced countermeasures on its ballistic missiles, this claim is simply not based in fact. Second, they claim that the site is a violation of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty because the Aegis Ashore sites contain the Mark 41 launcher, which could be used to launch a ground-based cruise missile. As you're well aware, the United States declared Russia in non-compliance of the INF Treaty in July 2014 because it had indeed tested a Glick'em with a range of between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, which is specifically prohibited by the INF Treaty. Now, there are a couple of problems with the Russian argument that the Aegis Ashore site is a violation of the INF Treaty. First, the Aegis Ashore sites do not have the hardware or the software to launch a ground launch missile. Second, the basing agreement between the US and Romania specifically only allows for the deployment of a non-nuclear missile defense interceptors at the site. Glick'ems are not allowed. Third, I would argue if the US really wanted to deploy ground-launched cruise missiles to Europe, we would not put them in a vulnerable fixed site. We'd probably do something similar to the Russians, not necessarily a ground-launch mobile system, but sea and air-based systems. Now, I certainly would be open to transparency with the Russians with regards to the Aegis Ashore sites under certain conditions. First, it needs to be part of a deal that brings Russia back into compliance with the INF Treaty in a verifiable manner. Second, it would require the consent of the host nations. Now, let me conclude by addressing the points that some have made that given the changing security environment in Europe, the United States and NATO should reorientate the EPAA towards Russia. I think this is an extremely bad idea for several reasons. First, the Russians do not do many things well. But one thing that the Russians know how to do well is build advanced ballistic missiles and sophisticated countermeasures. Therefore, even the most advanced missile defenses would have a major challenge dealing with Russia's ballistic missiles. Second, reorientating NATO's missile defense system towards Russia, even if it had the technical capability to do so, would be highly divisive within the alliance. Honestly, I do not believe there is a missile defense solution to the strategic challenge that Russia presents. That said, the United States and our allies do need to respond effectively to the Russian challenge. In my view, the United States should do this by continuing to fund the modernization of its strategic nuclear delivery systems, especially the Long-Range Standoff Cruise Missile, or LRSO. The LRSO will provide the United States with the ability to penetrate the sophisticated defenses that Russia is developing and thus improve our ability to hold critical Russian targets at risk. I also recommend developing a conventional variant of the LRSO, which will allow the United States to deliver conventional payloads in heavily contested air defense environments with the appropriate standoff range. Finally, the United States should facilitate the purchase by our allies of air and sea launch conventional strike capabilities such as JASSM-ER and Tomahawk. So let me stop there and turn the floor over back to you, Jeff. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Frank. That's a great way to get us started. A review of the negotiations with Romania and also the current strategic situation. With that, I think I would turn to General Moulton, and I think he's got a presentation for us, which will cover some other aspects of how we got to where we are and where we stand and what that means for us now. So with that, General Moulton, please.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to do the same thing that Frank just did, but I'm going to parallel it with how an operator looks at missile defense. And so we're going to, as the title shows here, it's from idea to reality from an operator's perspective. Harken all the way back to European missile defense in 1944. It was a terrible time to live in London or Antwerp. Thousands of V2s were coming at you. And I stole this slide from the RAF Museum outside of London. And it was particularly dismaying for a fighter pilot to see that their first statement they said is that you had no ability to defend against it. And what was even worse was, of course, the fact that you really could only get at defense by stopping it from launching in the first place. Today, we would call that attack operations. But today, the good news is that we have indeed invested significantly in the fact that the threat remains and has proliferated, and we've invested in how to try to take care of this problem. When I came on the scene in 2008 into Europe, I was focused obviously on the operations of the US and how it partnered with our allies in Europe across the 52 nations that the US describes as the broader European region. At that time, there were plenty of people that thought that there was plenty of missile defense in Europe. And they were thinking along the lines of that. Well, those countries have indeed some missile defense. But when you really peel the onion back, you find that indeed those red dots are more accurate about what was protected in Europe with the lower tier systems that were there in 2008, or that remain there today. Even more dismaying is the fact that if you talk about a threat from Southwest Asia, those systems really aren't going to be effective. So unless we have Italy attacking France, that's probably not the right place to have that capability. What did happen, though, is in 2009, the US made a strategic commitment to NATO partners and to the European population broadly with the identification and the execution of the European phase adaptive approach that Frank described. And it was three phases of bringing out equipment, but turning that into reality operationally. And that's what we went through over the following years. And the good news is that on time, on target, it was delivered the first phase. And what that first phase gave you was the ability to take a ship and put that ship with the Aegis system of missile defense to the right place at the right time. And you can see what it protected. More notably, though, is that phase two, which was delivered and then declared operationally capable by NATO last June, introduced the Aegis Ashore system, the most significant improvement in missile defense. And what that gives you now is, notice that instead of a bunch of red dots, you now have a significant portion of Southeast Europe that's protected. By the way, those are not Missile Defense Agency blobs, those are Punch Moulton blobs on the chart, but they're rather representative of what is protected in Europe. Now, the big significance is that. It's Deveselu, it is Aegis Ashore. It's an amazing capability to take what was a ship and put it on land and to make it useful. And what's notable is that as that one has been delivered, we are now on our way to the third phase, which is Aegis Ashore in Poland, and the introduction of the SM-3 Block 2A missile, which is a significant improvement. And with both of those together, we suddenly look at defense of all NATO territory, populations, and forces, as NATO committed to in Lisbon, Chicago, and Warsaw. What I'd like to do for a brief minute is to, from an operator's perspective, talk about what missile defense means when you talk about it from, as this was designed, a Southwest Asia axis threat, and as noted by Frank, is not at all, and by all the physics people that can actually understand basic physics, it's not about Russia. What it is about is expanded coverage, significant expanded coverage. It's also, especially in the case of Aegis Ashore, about persistence. Not subject to the vagaries of maritime usefulness of ships where they may be called away to do another mission someplace. Aegis Ashore and Deveselu, Aegis Ashore when it comes into Poland, will be persistently manned and on the watch all the time. That's a significant amount of NATO population that's protected. The other thing as we look forward in alliance with the title of this conference or this panel today is that Aegis Ashore in Romania, Aegis Ashore in Poland is actually leading missile defense globally. I just came back from facilitating a war game last week for the entire week with all of the U.S. combatant commands that are dealing with missile defense. And every one of them is looking at and trying to feel their way through to how Aegis Ashore is an implementation of their missile defense in their respective regions. So quite literally, you are the standard bearer in Romania as Aegis Ashore is looking to be the clear foundation for missile defense in the future. One last item that I really want to mention is the fact that with a significant amount of commitment to the capabilities that missile defense brings, in the end, the reason why people are safe in Europe today is because of those operators. It's operators that are standing watch 24/7 in Deveselu. It is operators that are aboard ships. It is operators that are in the command posts that are all part of linking all the way up to the highest levels of NATO leadership for defense. And it's because of them that we have a significant new capability in Europe that defends NATO territory, populations, and forces. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to you, Jeff. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Punch. And Maciej, if you wouldn't mind giving us a view from a Polish perspective, because of course Poland is the next big thing in the EPAA. So please.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jeffrey. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Maciej Kowalsi. I'm a research fellow at the Kazimierz Pułaski Foundation. First, I want to thank CSIS for having me here. It's great to be back in DC and to tell you a little bit more about the Polish perspective on the future of European missile defense. Since Poland joined NATO 18 years ago, we have been a reliable alliance member and a stalwart supporter of the idea of collective defense. BMD cooperation is just the latest example of this fact. Proliferation of missile technology has already prompted NATO to declare BMD as the alliance's core task. As has already been mentioned during the 2010 Lisbon summit, NATO collectively decided to develop territorial ballistic missile defense for the protection of population, territories, and deployed forces. Consequently, Aegis Ashore sites are set to become an indispensable part of the European security architecture. Poland recognizes the threat posed by the spread of missile technology and welcomes NATO's commitment to provide BMD to the entire European territory. However, it should be noted that prime targets for a rogue state missile attack are located in Western Europe, not in Poland. That's because, however harsh or unjust it might sound, an attack on Berlin, Paris, or London would incite more shock and terror in the international community than an attack on Warsaw. And nevertheless, in the name of collective defense, Poland decided to host Aegis Ashore and to put itself on the forefront of fight against such threats. This in turn put Poland on the map of a potential conflict. In the past, Polish troops participated in a number of NATO and US-led missions. Afghanistan, Iraq, or fight against ISIS are just a few examples. Similarly, Poland proudly contributes to the security of our allies in the area of missile defense. Poland was, is, and will be committed to NATO's core principle of collective defense, which means as much getting as it means giving. Moreover, there should be no doubt that Aegis Ashore is designed and equipped to counter ballistic missiles originating outside of the Euro-Atlantic area. In other words, and from the Polish perspective, it is not directed in the direction which Poland perceives as the main threat to its security. The EPAA is not the only way in which Poland contributes to the NATO's BMD and air defense capabilities. We're in the midst of the largest military modernization program in a country's history, with well over $10 billion allocated to air and missile defense alone. We already host and operate 6 long-range air surveillance radars, which possess a TBM defense capability, and we've already given this capability to NATO BMD. We are also procuring the medium-range air defense Wisła system. It will be capable of terminal phase BMD, and we've committed over $7 billion for procurement of 16 Patriot fire units. This case is ongoing. Radars and interceptors of this system will be integrated and made available to NATO BMD. Also in the pipeline are other SHORAD and VSHORAD systems, to name just a few: Narew, Piorun, Poprad, Pilica, and much more. Finally, I want to stress that Poland has been consistently spending the 2% of GDP on its defense. And per latest governmental guidelines and plans, this number is expected to grow 2.5% to 2.5% and more over time. Now, turning over to the threats that are present on the eastern flank, Russia is the primary threat to the security of Poland. The anti-access area denial bubble of Kaliningrad is perhaps the most pressing issue, with implications for NATO's collective defense capabilities. Offensive and defensive systems that have been placed in Kaliningrad outmatch Polish and NATO forces in several areas, and by a large margin. They restrict the freedom of movement of Allied troops, undercut Alliance's ability to maintain a land connection to the Baltic states, and pose a potential danger to Allied soldiers on the ground. Our hope and our intent is that all Allied resources will eventually form an integrated air and missile defense system, fully interoperable among allies and capable of balancing Russia's tactical advantages. Poland would also welcome other Allied air warfare assets, such as THAAD batteries, Patriot batteries, or aviation detachments. However, thus far, we have not provided, or even planned for, an adequate answer to Russia's extended range anti-air warfare assets. One way to fill this gap and to strengthen the alliance's collective defensive capability on the eastern flank would be adding AAW missiles to the Aegis Ashore sites. It is important to say that Aegis Ashore's limited ability to strike air targets on over-the-horizon ranges would not shift the regional balance of power. Russia would still have major advantages in several key areas. However, it would fundamentally change the calculus for Kremlin's provocations over the Baltic. I'm hoping that, if time permits, we can discuss this in more detail during the conversation. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I give the voice back to Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maciej. And Tom, please, you all know Tom. You've already heard his comments during the discussion, but please wrap this all together for us, and then we can get into discussion.
Thank you, Jeff. I think it was, of course, mentioned earlier that the United States has just formally embarked on a missile defense policy review by both presidential direction and congressional mandate. This is, of course, both a ballistic missile defense review and about integrated air and missile defense, the full spectrum of missile defense and missile defeat for both ballistic missiles and other types of missiles, cruise missiles, and sort of hybrid boost glide vehicles. But whether we're talking about Europe, the Middle East, the Asia Pacific, or the US homeland, missile defenses serve important strategic purposes to support deterrence, assurance, and damage limitation in the event of deterrence failure. And as we look out at the strategic environment today, and all the various threats that are emerging, we see a lot of missiles out there, of various kinds and of various characteristics. And there's just too many missile-armed actors and too much uncertainty to forego defenses against them. So I want to talk about four things. First, the continued strategic utility of missile defense in Europe. Second, kind of the threat from both Iran and Russia. Third, the relative balance of focus on the part of the United States between homeland and regional missile defense. And fourth, some kind of architecture or CONOPS and about flexibility as well. Now, on the strategy side, that contribution, the principal contribution of missile defense to deterrence and defense overall was, of course, noted in the 2010 BMDR, and I fully expect that the review that the Trump administration is now underway with will likely reaffirm its utility as well. Even limited defenses can have strategic effect by buying time, complicating an attack, improving the credibility of response, increasing flexibility, creating options, and really supporting overall defensive operations. And as was said, the 28 member nations of NATO seemed to agree and made missile defense a core alliance mission in 2010. Specifically, territorial defense, not just for Poland and Romania, but for the populations and territory of all NATO, for which the deployment of the SM-32A will be necessary. But the mission today is, of course, just as necessary as it was in 2010 and was reaffirmed by the alliance in Warsaw last summer. Specifically, this is because of the threat, in part from nations like Iran, but also from other things. Now, some have claimed that the Iran nuclear agreement, assuming it lasts, negates the need to continue with European missile defense, since deterring Iran was its justification. But as Frank ably noted, that was expressly about both the missile and nuclear issues. And just to put it bluntly, the price of not having a comprehensive agreement that included missiles is that they remain a going concern. When Russia suggested a few years ago that the JCPOA removed the need for missile defense, NATO strongly disagreed, as did Secretary John Kerry in discussions with his Russian counterpart. It's also important, of course, to recognize that the JCPOA could fall apart or go away for any number of reasons, and we ought to stay ahead of that threat. We have a relative degree of confidence today in respect to a prospective North Korean ICBM because we've been working on some kind of national missile defense for 20 years. If in a few years the Iranian deal collapses, if Iran should go back to trying to get a nuclear weapon, or if they should acquire some long-range missiles from other sources, it would be difficult to start from scratch and try to catch up. Missile defenses take years to build and deploy. It's not the sort of thing that will snap back into place as sanctions allegedly would. But the Iran problem is different and distinct from the Russia problem. And in my view, what we must not do is to compromise NATO's defense or the United States defense on the slim hope that we might appease Russia in some way. Some folks in Washington like to think that the United States is always just one more missile defense concession away from making Russia happy, less paranoid and aggressive, and less reliant on nuclear weapons. And some have gone so far as to suggest that we should trade away the Redzhakova site, for instance, or perhaps have empty tubes there, or perhaps even just do it unilaterally in the hope of inspiring better actions by Russia. And I happen to disagree. Cancellation of the Poland site or taking steps to roll back Romania or NATO efforts more broadly would undermine, I think, the alliance, would create concern among allies, and do exactly nothing to improve relations with Russia. Of course, as has been said, European-based missile defenses are not and have not been about undermining Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent, its ICBMs and such. We don't have the capability, capacity, or intent to do that with NATO BMD. But precisely because missile defenses contribute to deterrence in the principled sense, we should, I think, consider how additional low-tier air defense and potentially theater missile defenses can contribute to deterring aggression. And notwithstanding, I would say, our inability within sort of Washington popular circles to put Russia and missile defense in the same sentence, I would like to suggest that that kind of a posture is in some ways not very different from where we actually are today and where we're going. As you've heard today, various members of NATO in their national capacity are pursuing air and low-tier defenses. That larger strategic rationale is why it makes sense today for NATO forces and the European Reassurance Initiative, whether in Lithuania or other places, to be deployed with defenses like Patriot. In other words, point defense and force protection. As was mentioned as well, Poland and Romania are currently in negotiations on a national basis for Patriot assets of their own. They're not doing it to defend against the Iranian Air Force. And we saw a news story today about the U.S. perhaps putting a Patriot unit in Lithuania. Such a posture, in principle, could help with the cruise missile and other short-range threats like those conspicuously deployed in Kaliningrad, including but not limited to the cruise missiles in violation of the INF Treaty. And I agree with my friend Frank Rose about many things. I commend many of the recommendations he made today. I would also agree with him in endorsing cruise missile defense to protect alliance assets in the event of conflict with Russia, which therefore would degrade the effectiveness of the Russian INF violations. Next, let me say something about kind of the broader picture of U.S. missile defense efforts. What you might say in NATO speak is sort of the transatlantic link. In other words, the homeland regional balance. That ongoing missile defense review is specifically directed to look at the relative balance between those two things. While some are, you might say, speculating this could result in more emphasis being moved from regional to homeland defense, I certainly hope that it doesn't result in less for U.S. forces and the NATO alliance in Europe. It's true that the 2013 cancellation of the fourth phase of EPAA in a sense decoupled the two, but today is a new day. And as the Trump administration looks forward, I would hazard the suggestion that there may be opportunities to not merely grow and evolve the defenses for Europe, but also perhaps to recouple investments for the NATO allies situated in North America. The broad BMDS, ballistic missile defense system, is a global enterprise, and continued efforts at integration and that recoupling, I think, could very well make sense. It might be in the form, as was in phase 4 of the EPAA, with 4 deployed interceptors for the U.S. homeland, or it might be something else. It might be sensors, radars of various kinds. It might be a space-based sensor constellation which really supports everything from regional to homeland. Finally, let me say one more thing about Aegis Ashore. I think Punch was alluding to a bit of this earlier, about Aegis Ashore, not really so much in terms of, you might say, the capability of the interceptors, but as a kind of model or template for air and missile defense broadly, kind of the CONOPS of missile defense, as it were. It is true that you can fit many wonderful things into VLS tubes, both afloat and otherwise, but it's the ability to mix and match lower tier interceptors, not merely the SM-3, but other things, SM-6, ESSM, that kind of thing. That kind of approach, put aside the Aegis Ashore sites themselves, but I think that flexibility, that adaptability, is something that might inform other regional missile defense deployments. If you might have not merely greater distribution of launch capability, but also mixed loads, rather than having to decide whether you want THAAD or Patriot, THAAD or SM-3. The idea of perhaps having a mixed and matched, just in the same way that a ship would have many different effectors in tubes. That kind of inherent flexibility and adaptability is the sort of thing that might be useful not merely to the U.S., maybe also perhaps allies like Japan, or U.S. forces in Guam and Hawaii, among other things. So I think in that sense, The effort on Aegis Ashore is important not merely for Europe, but also for kind of the capability much more broadly. What if, for instance, a single site, whether it be in Hawaii or Guam, had SM-6s with Patriots and all these other things? Think of it as a kind of layered defense in a box. It's that kind of concept that I think could prove promising for the future. So let me just say in closing that I think, from my point of view, we ought to stay the course, complete and continue to expand the efforts at Redzikova, and also explore some of these options for non-strategic theater defenses to improve deterrence of NATO. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tom, and thanks to all the panelists for your presentations. I'm going to start with one or two questions from my side. I encourage those of you in the audience who would also like to ask questions to think them through, and I'll turn to you in just a minute or two. But if I could start with the panelists, there were a couple of references to the NATO Lisbon Summit in 2010. I happened to have the privilege of working on the NATO international staff at that time and worked on the strategic concept, which for the first time established a balance between conventional nuclear and missile defense forces as comprising NATO's deterrent. And so I guess the question, and Frank, you alluded to this a bit, but I want to maybe draw you out and ask the others' opinions on this. Do you see the appropriate balance between conventional nuclear and missile defense forces changing in the current security environment? And if so, how? Frank,
yeah, honestly, I don't see that balance changing. I think that the alliance at the Warsaw Summit put together a very comprehensive set of initiatives to deal with the emerging security environment, specifically the threat from Russia. We have the European Reassurance Initiative. The United States and a number of allies are participating in that, and I agree with the point that the ambassador made that we can't just be concerned about the Baltics. We also need to be concerned about Russian activities in the Black Sea. But secondly, I also think it's very important that NATO continue to move forward with the nuclear initiatives that were agreed to at the Warsaw Summit to show Russia that, one, NATO remains a nuclear alliance, and two, has the technical capabilities and the willpower to respond should deterrence fail.
No, I think certainly the nuclear language at the Warsaw Summit was something remarkable compared to previous years. Punch, your view on the balance.
Real quick, I agree with Frank. I don't see a change, and it's because I see the assumptions and the definitions to be different. In the end, the missile defense capabilities that are going into Europe, the missile defense capabilities that are actually broadly, regionally deployed, end up being, even in the homeland defense, limited in their nature. We have a capacity limitation, not necessarily a capability limitation. And that capacity drives us to, as Tom alluded, options that you gain for a brief period of time, but they are not something that would be in the long haul able to provide, if you will, a sheer umbrella of defense over the NATO, Europe, or any other region for an extended period of time. Mm-hmm. There is in the end, the capacity issue always rears its ugly head.
Okay, Maciej.
I think gentlemen already mentioned the broader NATO perspective on things. So speaking strictly from a Polish perspective, I'd like to say that I don't think there's much discussion about placement of any of nuclear weapons in Poland. Right. There's very little discussion of how the nuclear posture works on the larger scale. We're more concerned with the hybrid warfare, with the local conflicts. So we invest heavily in those assets that could become very handy in case of a limited conventional attack. So air defense, also strike capability, long-range artillery, things like that. So in Poland, it's absolutely the shift is towards the conventional warfare, towards the hybrid warfare, and the nuclear is almost non-existent.
Mm-hmm. Tom?
So I would say, just to go after the question, do we change from the mix, the appropriate mix of these things? I would say compared to what? Compared to where we are in 2016 or where we're kind of seem to be going? I think that where we seem to be going is in the right direction of doing more conventional, being more pronounced about and articulate about the nuclear, but also evolving this other piece, which is really air defense.
Right.
And air and low-tier missile defense. And so where you see Poland going, where you see Romania going, they're going in the right direction. Whether in relative terms that kind of tweaks the overall balance, I think, is sort of a nuance. But what I would say is I think we ought to be more explicit, and really so much of my presentation is about kind of being honest with ourselves from a policy point of view, that not only do we have a Russia problem, which I think the Warsaw Summit was very clear about, but we have a Russia missile problem. And that's why I think especially kind of cruise missile defense and things like that, low-tier stuff, anti-air warfare, that's probably an area of potential growth. I think we're heading in the right direction, but I think we ought to be more clear about that.
Okay. My second question before I turn to you in the audience is related to that, actually, because, Frank, you said something along the lines of there's not a missile defense solution to the Russian strategic challenge. On the other hand, I guess the question is, as Tom is suggesting, there is an air missile defense component to the response. And I guess I'd ask for the panelists' views on, if you accept Tom's proposition, what are more specifically the sorts of national contributions you would look for, and from whom within NATO? And we can start with you, Frank, and work your way down.
A couple of weeks ago, Sandy Vershbow, the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and I had an article in The Hill in which we endorsed limited cruise missile defense. The reason we did that is, one, we wanted to be able to respond to Russia's violation of the INF Treaty, but also their development of cruise missiles, because it's not just this treaty-prohibited cruise missile we're concerned about. They have been modernizing their air and sea launch capabilities. They have other systems. So it's important. But we also recognize that air defense and cruise missile defense are very similar. Ballistic missile defense is a little bit different. Furthermore, I think it's very important to note, and Tom and Punch alluded to this, you can't protect everything with cruise missile defense. It's exceedingly expensive and, I believe, not a good use of resources. However, you can protect some of your key assets, airfields, command and control centers, and therefore that was the reason we endorsed limited cruise missile defense. Now, for example, some U.S. missile defense systems do have limited cruise missile defense capabilities. Patriot PAC-3 has limited cruise missile defense capabilities. So what I would recommend is we continue with our deployments of Patriot PAC-3 in Europe, and we support the excellent efforts that some of our allies like Poland and Romania are making to try to deny the Russians benefit. But I think we need to be very clear that we are not seeking to undermine Russia's strategic deterrent. As I mentioned earlier, the Russians know how to build ballistic missiles with very sophisticated countermeasures. And even our best missile defense systems would be very challenged dealing with that threat. Secondly, it's cost prohibitive. I know President Trump talked about a major increase in the defense budget, but that's looking increasingly unlikely we're going to have a major increase in the defense budget. And those dollars are going to be competing for other capabilities, especially the Strategic Modernization Program. So I think a limited approach focused on protecting the alliance's key command and control nodes and ports and airfields is the right approach. But I also do want to emphasize that saying that we should go after the Russian strategic deterrent, removing the word limited from the National Missile Defense Act, that's not going to improve our security. I hope that the next BMDR, which is now underway, I'm happy that I'm not involved in this one, hopefully that will make it very clear that our policy with regards to Russia and China's strategic deterrent remains unchanged.
Thanks. Punch.
Let me spring off what Frank said. We're not going to be able to take on the massive attack that would come from Russia. At the same time, a world-class ballistic missile and then eventually cruise missile capability defense-wise could defang what would be the achieved objectives that a Russian attack would be, therefore deterring. So if we can defang it to the point that it is much less effective for them, then there suddenly is a new calculus inside the choice when it's made in the first place. With specifics, the place that other nations could contribute to European ballistic and cruise missile defense would be in the place where there's scarcity today. Scarcity today, from my perspective, is fundamentally in two places. One is in the sensor suite that would be able to help us identify and then cue so that something can happen. And the second place is in the actual interceptors themselves. That means Western European nations who have Aegis systems, developing them with the ability to then follow into both interceptor capability and sensor suites. It is sensors to be able to identify cruise missiles, which today should be networked well together but are not across the Eastern European borders, if you will. And also headed down the path of what kind of interceptors can be broadly proliferated so that we can get back towards that defang idea.
All right, great. Maciej.
Yeah, I believe that Eastern Europe and Poland in particular very well understand the fact that you have to contribute to your own defense. And that goes for air defense just as it does for anything else. So why our main modernization program, which is the VSWAT, the medium range air defense, why is it taking so long? Well, that's because we've decided that we want to really have it cutting edge. So we want network-centric warfare. We want to be able to integrate sensors and shooters. We want to be able to cooperate swiftly with our allies who are acquiring air defense assets, such as Lithuania is getting the NASAMS, and Germany, of course, they have the MEADS, and other countries in the area. So I think the response and where I would see more assets being needed is if other countries also participated in their small share that they can, to buy single sensors, single shooters. And if we will be able to integrate that into a bigger integrated air and missile defense system, that would be a true deterrent that would raise a cost of a potential attack on our territory to an unacceptable level to any aggressor. So,
I'm sure Washington will look forward to a Polish diplomatic effort to encourage those kinds of contributions from allies. Tom.
Yeah, actually, I think what you're seeing here is some pretty sharp convergence, and I think it's a highly precise direction here in the again the strategic utility of even limited air and missile defense against those kind of cruise missile threats. Ain't enough sensors, that's for sure. But also with respect to, it's not about catching every single vantage point. It is about protecting those particular points, those airfields, et cetera. And to go back to connect this to your previous question, Jeff, it's about doing exactly those things that contribute to the overall deterrence and defense posture.
Right, that's great. Well, I'd like to turn to the audience now and ask for your questions. Great, you all know the drill, so please name an affiliation and a question rather than a comment. So we'll start with the woman in the back with her hand up, and then we'll make our way forward. Sorry, could you speak up a little bit? Or,
I'll repeat it.
wait.
Here now?
There we
Yeah.
go.
So I would like to question that there is a real threat, missile threat to Europe from Iran, because Iran only has medium-range missiles that can't reach Poland, and for the past 10 years, Iran hasn't even shown much interest in developing longer-range missiles. But even if Iran would decide to develop an intermediate range missile that would reach Poland, the testing would take 3 to 5 years, according to Michael Elleman. And the building of the site in Poland, I mean, it was scheduled to take less than 3 years, and now it has already gone on for a year. So even if you would need to start from the scratch, there would be plenty of time to respond. So what's the hurry with building the Polish site?
Okay, thank you. We had 2 other hands up, so why don't we take questions from there as well, and then we can respond.
Yeah, my name is Wayne Schroeder, and I'm with I'm Schroeder Defense Group. Didn't hear anything about MEADS. You know, the Germans and the Italians have significant equities in MEADS, notwithstanding the U.S. Army's failure to fully fund its development. So with or MEADS, where do we go with MEADS with respect to the Germans and the Italians? And then the second question, and Punch, this might be addressed best to you. You know, we've got these sea-based platforms with Aegis-capable BMD ships, our cruisers and destroyers, but could we not also look to smaller platforms, frigate-sized platforms, LCS-sized platforms, to be able to put BMD capability out there much more readily in the future? So those 2 questions on systems.
Okay, great. And then a gentleman here in the front, or halfway up, please.
Mark Stone, missile defense and mathematical analyst. First question for Mr. Rose with regard to the long-range standoff cruise missile, having both a conventional and nuclear version of that. Do you think that makes the conventional version unusable, the same concern we had with the Tomahawk land attack missile, nuclear and conventional version some years ago? And then for the general, I'll sort of slightly violate the Karako rule and just note that Lisbon was just outside of your coverage region, and I wonder if you have a comment on that.
Okay, so why don't I ask panelists to respond to those questions? Yep. Frank, we'll let you go first.
On LRSO, I would note that we currently have deployed a nuclear version of the air-launched cruise missile in a conventional variant, and that has not undermined strategic stability. We have dual capable bombers. The B-2 is a conventional bomber as well as a nuclear bomber. We have dual capable aircraft deployed in Europe. So I really don't understand this argument. Now, TLAM-N, as you noted, was retired in 2010. But that was primarily not because of stability concerns, but about reliability and age issues. I think, and I hope, one of the things that the new administration looks at in the upcoming NPR, whether it would make sense to reintroduce a TLAM-N type of capability. With regards to the question on Iran, you rightly note that Iran has not yet tested a intermediate range ballistic missile, but they continue their development of medium range capabilities. There have been a number of tests since the JCPOA entered into force. Those capabilities have the range to hit NATO territory and population centers, and fundamentally, they have all the building blocks necessary to move forward with longer range systems should they choose to do so. With regards to MEADS, I fully agree with you. MEADS is a really important capability. Like you, I'm very sorry that the United States decided not to pursue MEADS, because one of the great technical advancements of the MEAD systems is the 360-degree radar. Patriot can only engage threats on a 120-degree angle. So perhaps one of the issues that we look at in the BMDR would be perhaps purchasing MEAD from the Germans and the Italians. In addition to the radar, it's much more mobile than Patriot. Remember, MEADS was originally designed to move quickly with the deployed forces. Now, Patriot is mobile, but it is slow and difficult to move, and the airlift requirements are substantial, where my understanding, and Punch can correct me if I'm wrong, is that I think MEADS has about a third of the airlift requirements compared to Patriot.
Punch, please.
Oh, okay, well, let me, I'll start there to keep the dialogue going, and then I'll come back to the Lisbon discussion. The element that really matters is what you highlighted. It's the 360 radar. And the 360 radar capability slapped onto Patriot, I think indeed provides fundamentally the same approach and the same way forward. So I'm not an investor in Lockheed or Raytheon, so I don't have any particular equities here. What I want to see is capability, and 360 is an ultimate necessity to be able to deal with the future. But remember that in the end, the MEAD system looks like those red dots that I showed before. It will be able to protect small locations. It's not going to be able to get at the broader swaths that you get from the area defense capabilities of the upper tier systems. With respect to Lisbon, let me tell you that those were merely blobs to try to get at the essence of it. And so don't drive yourselves to the shortfalls of PowerPoint. Rather, in fact, I've been through, I just finished up 2 months ago my third in a row annual exercise for NATO, where I facilitated missile defense as they plan their way through for Strike Force NATO, which is in Lisbon. So I'm very familiar with the fact that as we sit down and work our way through wargaming of missile defense in Lisbon, that it's underneath the umbrella of the long haul. With respect to the ships and their capabilities, the answer is yes, it would be wonderful to have them all over the place. What is unique is certainly the VLS system that is so vital to the Aegis and the SM-3 employment and the SM-6 employment. We've walked in the efforts that we've been doing for Missile Defense Agency and for the combatant commands. We've walked down the path of how ships with the SM-6 provide, and the sea-based terminal capability, provide defense of territory in a very short local area, and that may be something that not only is beneficial in the long haul for the U.S., but also to partner nations who have Aegis or maybe would network their capabilities in. And finally, to the question about Iran and Poland and why not stop, I would tell you that first of all, Iran has a space program which instantaneously gives them fundamentally the capacity to be able to go long range. So medium range capability is today's environment, but as Frank said, the ability to be able to predict when an Iran would decide to percolate up to an intermediate range or longer capability is probably unfathomable to even our best intelligence analysts. It's more down the path of timing. So I would challenge the 3 to 5 year. And by the way, if you were to stop today, it would be actually worse than going all the way back to square one. Among other things, you would probably now be dealing with what would we want to do to take advantage of the technological improvements that have happened in the interim time. So for instance, if you were to march your way forward to the year 2019, having paused the deployment into Poland, you would probably find yourself with at least a 3-year execution to be able to get yourself up and on the step. Furthermore, as I mentioned, Aegis Ashore is providing the foundation for missile defense globally, and Poland and Romania and their ability to be able to work together will be a brand new epic for missile defense in NATO. Failing to develop that second site would be to remain a unitary Aegis Ashore capability. So there's significance there. And finally, and Tom alluded to this earlier, Aegis Ashore in Poland was originally thought of as the commencement of an early interceptor for something that comes to the U.S. homeland. That was going to be the SM-3 Block 2 Bravo missile. Son of that missile ought to be part of our dialogue, and I hope it is a part of the BMDR, because quite clearly the ability to build the opportunity to intercept early gives a homeland defense mission the ability to be able to shoot, assess, shoot, and assess, and shoot again. And that shoot, assess, shoot mentality provides increased confidence in your ability to defend the homeland.
Okay, great. Maciej.
I'll start with the MIADS. Absolutely. MIADS is still on the table also in Poland. So we have an ongoing FMS case for the Patriot, but MIADS is a second in case these negotiations fall through. And likewise in Germany, when the contract for MIADS is signed, I mean, absolutely is going to be a vital asset in the region, especially considering the number of fire units that Germany is procuring. So no one's forgetting about MIADS. It's an important asset. Going back to the 360-degree capability that was mentioned here, that's another reason why Wisła is taking so long. We want the 360 capability, and Patriot doesn't have it right now. So we've been in discussion with Raytheon and with Lockheed Martin for a very long time, and we've even agreed that the first 4 fire units would have the sectoral radar, but the remaining fire units have to have the 360-degree capability. And now going to the question about Iran, again, even if a particular missile is not aimed at Poland, this is about collective defense. So Redzikovo is about collective defense. So we deploy it to protect the entire territory of NATO. So we're not just worried about the missiles that just go 1 mile above our border. We want to really contribute to the collective defense. And also, if you take a look at North Korea, for example, on the recent parade, they showed off probably 8 or more new missiles or spin-offs of old missiles that we had, as an open source community, we had no idea that they're there. So it just shows you how easy it is to conceal construction of such missiles. And I would not agree that it takes only 3 years to build a base. President Obama proposed the EPA in 2009. We're now in 2017, and we're only celebrating the first anniversary of the Deveselu, right? And Redzikovo is still under construction. So stop it now or cancel it now and go through the whole process of NATO approval and choosing site and ratification all over again. That alone will take you several years. Thank you.
Let me respond one more that I forgot to mention, and that is the fact that today in Yemen, Scud missiles have been launched into Saudi Arabia, not by a nation state, but by actors inside a nation state, quite likely empowered by somebody from outside that region specifically. So I don't even have to say the word Iran to say that Southwest Asia could end up being a threat to the NATO region by missiles that would be coming from some other place on the planet. And for me, that this has been something that is quite frightening and portends bad over the long haul, because we are in the space now where if the wrong actor decided to help out the Houthis in Yemen, and Yemen wanted to, the Houthis wanted to employ from Yemen, we could have the same problem from not Iran, but from a non-state actor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tom.
So I think what you've been hearing here is a lot of the, especially in reaction to the program question, it's really about the characteristics, right? And so you heard a lot about the 360-degree coverage, which, by the way, the U.S. Army back in the 1990s said, hey, we got to get at this new cruise missile problem so that we're, it's not just the Soviet Union coming exactly from that direction, but cruise missile problem that could come from anywhere. So that's been known and been pursued, and there's broad agreement on the need to go after that, whatever the program is that gets at it. Second, I think in the ship question kind of gets at this. When you first started asking the question, well, what about putting these kind of things on LCS or frigates or that kind of thing? At first I thought you were going down the distributed lethality question, because what's the Navy's concept there? Put strike forces on anything that floats, right? But the reverse of that, which I like to toy with, is distributed defense. And that's, I think, what your question really points to. The difficulty of a distributed defense concept, either on ships of various kinds or on land in lots of different places, is, of course, you can't have a Spy-1 radar on every dinghy, and so you got to have that networking of capabilities so you can shoot on remote and all that kind of stuff, as everybody knows. But connect that, as I said, to land. The Army's out there talking about this multi-domain battle thing. Well, again, thinking about not about the Aegis system as such, but the characteristics and the capabilities of it to link lots of different places and lots of different boxes that contain interceptors and effectors of various kinds. And all of a sudden you create, not with the cost of an additional ship, but the cost of a cargo container or something, a lot of capability in a lot of different places. And I'll just leave it there.
Okay, I think we got time for one more. Gentleman in the front will give you the mic.
Thank you. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, Japan native U.S. citizen, member of Reagan Foundations. Can I switch to Asia Pacific? I need to talk about the THAAD system that we have. My question is that system has not been tested. Somebody told me. I don't think so, but my question is how reliable that is because of North Korea threat. Seoul, South Korea is right there. Okinawa is right nearby. It really concerns me because I don't know. I don't have the answer. Number two, this is my speculation, but I know you're not CIA or anything like that, but North Korea may be helping each other with Iran or Pakistan, or it's just my speculation. Maybe you can comment on that one just as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, yep, we'll see if any of our panelists want to dive into this. Frank?
Well, let me tell you a funny story first. In Korean, they don't pronounce the TH, so it's pronounced sad. Well, I'm pretty well known in Korea because about 2 years ago, I gave this big interview with the leading paper, Chosun Ilbo, and I became known as Sad Man in Korea. So it's so funny. I was there in the summer of 2015 in Seoul, and I was with a young lady on my staff. Her family had immigrated to the United States from Korea in the 70s, but they still watched the Korean press very closely. And she was just so excited to be with me in Korea. And we were in the lounge of the hotel, and she said, "Frank, I have got to call my mom to let her know that I'm here in Korea with you. So she goes, comes back about a half an hour later, and she says, Frank, I just talked to my mom. And I said, I'm in Korea with Frank Rose. Well, I go, your mom knows who I am. She's like, no, not really. She knew your name was Frank and you worked for the State Department. But when I said Frank Rose, she said, you're in Korea with Sad Man? So I'm a knight in Romania. I am Sad Man in Korea. So that's the difference between the Asia Pacific and Europe. With regards to your question about THAAD, in the 1990s, THAAD had some real technical problems. To the Missile Defense Agency's credit, they halted testing, sat down, and figured out what went wrong with the system. And after several years of re-engineering the system, they began their test program again in the mid-2000s. And it was fundamentally a different system than the one that was developed in the mid-1990s. And it is an excellent system. I think since the mid-2000s, I believe it has not had a single failure. And why is THAAD so important? Well, THAAD is a unique missile defense system because it allows you to engage threats both outside the atmosphere and inside the atmosphere. Why is it so important in Korea? Well, let me tell you that. A lot of people and critics of missile defense say, well, THAAD really doesn't help you against the short-range threat in the Republic of Korea from North Korea. I fully agree. But that's not what THAAD is designed for. THAAD is not designed to defend Seoul from North Korean threats. THAAD is designed to deal with medium-range threats like North Korea's extended range Scuds and the no-dogs. Because if there's ever a crisis on the peninsula, one of the first things the North Koreans would try to do is make the airfields and the ports, places like Busan and others down south, unusable. And missile defenses, and particularly THAAD, provides a bubble so you can flow forces into the peninsula. Right now, the U.S. ROK alliance does not have an upper tier theater missile defense capability on the peninsula. We have Patriot, but we don't have that kind of theater-wide system. THAAD will close that capabilities gap. That's why it's so important. Now, our Chinese friends have argued that, like the Russians, I wonder if they've been talking, THAAD represents a threat to China's strategic deterrent. That is just false. THAAD is a theater missile defense capability that does not have the capability of intercepting Chinese ICBMs. Then they say, okay, we're not really concerned about the interceptors, we're concerned about the radar. And what I would say is, well, we already have 2 of these radars in Japan and other systems and radars. We've made it very clear in the BMDR in 2002 that we were not seeking to undermine China's strategic deterrent. I hope that in their BMDR, the Trump administration reasserts that position. Because like the Russians, the Chinese have very sophisticated countermeasures. And even if we were able to track their ICBMs with the THAAD radar, our limited ground-based mid-course defense system, which is located in Alaska and California, does not have the technical capability to intercept Chinese ICBMs. I think what this is really about with regards to China is twofold. One, they want to create problems within the ROK, and with the objective, I think, of weakening the U.S. ROK alliance. And I think they will continue, especially after the election yesterday, to express their concerns. Secondly, these guys, like the Russians, understand missile defense. They know that one THAAD battery is not going to undermine China's strategic deterrent. But the concern is what comes next. You know, additional THAAD batteries, additional Aegis Ashore systems in Japan. That's what they're very concerned about. And furthermore, they are concerned about trilateral cooperation between the U.S., ROK, and Japan on missile defense. So this is about bigger issues. And finally, let me just add, and I've told this to my ROK colleagues before, you need to look at China's objections to THAAD in the larger Chinese concern about global strategic stability. Both the Chinese and the Russians are very concerned that this is part of a U.S. conspiracy to develop a full range of new strategic capabilities, missile defense, space, precision strike, and other new technologies with the objective of undermining Russia and China's strategic deterrent. Now, we've been very clear we are not trying to seek their deterrent, undermine their deterrent, but, you know, the Russians are the Russians. There's an old saying in Russia, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you.
Punch?
One more item that to debunk the Chinese idea that, well, it's not the interceptors, we get that, but it's the radar. Well, the reality is that the radar points in one direction. And for the radar to be ready to defend the Republic of Korea from a North Korean attack, it's got to be pointed at North Korea, which doesn't give it much ability. I mean, there is some China north of North Korea, but not a lot. And arguably, the breadth of missiles that would be coming out of China that it would be watching and somehow supposedly contributing to strategic undermining, it would be folly out of the U.S. and the Republic of Korea to swing it around to the other side and therefore expose themselves to the North Korean threat, which is why it's there in the first place. So I find it to be, it borders on poppycock, but the reality is that it is not a risk, as Frank said. Now, with respect to reliability, I think Frank hit it mostly. Let me tell you one thing about it. The U.S. decided to deploy it to Guam, our homeland. So we've committed to doing that, and we've committed to buying more and having them ready to deploy. And arguably throughout Europe, there is a routine and desire to see THAAD in the region. Routinely, we hear nations throughout Europe saying, give us THAAD. We'd like to have THAAD here. We'd like to have THAAD there throughout. So whether or not you believe in all the testing, the reality is that others do because they know that it's rare. And we're betting our homeland on it, frankly. Now, with respect to, you're right, I'm not from the CIA, nor do I play one on TV. But what's actually frightening today is that North Korea has embarked on a very aggressive series of launches of their missiles. Something that's different than they've done in the past. And what it portends is the fact that they've committed themselves to rigorously testing their capability. At the point that they're willing to accept failures and move on is to put them in the place that we were, for instance, in the 1960s when we ended up with 13 launches before we got our first successful satellite up in the air during the early 1960s. If they continue to test and fail, but then roll right back in and try to find the solutions to that, you now have a North Korea who is actually putting meat on the bones of a missile program that they have. Now, who they proliferate that to and with, it is, for me, unfathomable, because Today, the circumstances of where we are with respect to North Korea proliferation are entirely different than they were 10 years ago. And I would argue that 10 years from now, we could be even in a worse situation or a better situation. I think the best thing we can do from a military perspective is to prudently plan on near the worst case. And that means that not only would we be worried about North Korea and its capabilities inside the Western Pacific region, but we'd be worried about what North Korea could give to other regions.
Okay, great. Maciej or Tom, anything to add to that?
Just very briefly, you were absolutely right. Iran and North Korea are cooperating on missile defense, and that's public knowledge. There are companies who trade missile technologies, and so absolutely right.
Yeah, I won't repeat anything that's been said here before. I think there is actually a lot of connective tissue between, of course, the Asia-Pacific region as such and the Europe, to bring it back to that, because it's the same system, it's the same toolbox. The second A in THAAD stands for area, and so those little red dots in Punch's map are a little bit bigger for THAAD than they are for Patriots. You can't have enough Patriots to defend anything over an area, that kind of thing. The difficulty, of course, even though THAAD is 13 for 13 out of its current system tests, the difficulty is, admittedly, you said a lot of people would like the THAAD. Well, I'd like to have a pony, but I'm not going to get it. The difficulty is it's really expensive as a unit. But if there is a way to get that very unique capability, right, which is endo and some exo, and get that and spread it out in a more cost-effective way, that would be a tremendous thing. So that you can put it in the Middle East, put it in the Asia Pacific, put it in Europe if you want. It's on that standard slide as a hedge for Europe. But when the US Army back in 2012 said, in the good days, this was pre kind of things going downhill, back in 2012 they need 9 THAAD batteries. They're on track for what, 7, maybe 8 now? And here we are in 2017. So we got to at least get back to that level. We might even need more of them. But if we can find some more imaginative ways and cheaper ways to get that capability out to a lot of different places, I think that'd be a good thing.
Hey, can I just add, I think foreign procurement of THAAD is a real good news story. For example, the United Arab Emirates has purchased 2 THAAD batteries. I believe the second one has been delivered or will shortly be delivered in the next couple of months. Saudi Arabia has expressed strong interest in the THAAD system. Furthermore, we've also heard that Japan is potentially interested in THAAD. Why is the foreign purchase of THAAD so important? Because, as Tom mentioned, the greater the quantity of the buy, the lower the cost, number one. And number two, it provides more capability out there in the field. And as I always note, the U.S. is a global power with global responsibilities, and we can't be everywhere all the time in full strength. Therefore, it's critical to have capable and interoperable allies who can work with us.
Okay, that's a great way to wrap it up. We've taken a journey today from Deveselu in Romania all the way around the world and back to Europe, which I think is a testimony to the how much is going on in the missile defense field, to the importance of U.S. alliance relationships in Europe, in the Asia Pacific, and in the Middle East. And how crucial those will be as we move forward, as the administration conducts its defense review, and as we continue to track all these things. So let me thank our panelists, Frank Rose, Punch Moulton, Maciej Kowalsi, Tom Karako, and let me, wait, no, I want to thank you for good questions and for coming here and sharing your time with us, because otherwise we'd be talking to an empty room. So thank you for coming and participating, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thank you.